himself and yes, what he's going to talk about. I think you said you'd assumed they knew what you were talking about.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, it's great to be here. That's one of the reasons it's great to be here. You actually produce things like this on TTIP, so I presume there's a little bit of knowledge maybe already in the room. So I've adjusted my talk to reflect that, although if there are any issues I don't raise and that you want covered, please do ask some questions afterwards. Just to explain to you what I'll talk about, I'll tell you a little bit about War and Want and where we come from, and a little bit about the way we conceive of TTIP, which is 3 pillars. And then I wanted to zero in on some very common myths which are propounded around TTIP, specifically around the environment, jobs, growth, jobs and growth, separate issues, small businesses, and then the corporate court system, which you've probably heard of, called ISDS. But to start with a little bit about War and Want. So we're a charity now that's now just over 60 years old. We come from the labour movement, that's where it originated, and that's a tradition that we've kept very much in line with. All the major trade unions in this country are affiliated to us. And we are a little bit different to the normal NGO working on international issues in that our slogan is "Poverty is political," and that really underscores our approach to what we might call international development. And that is that a lot of the problems around poverty and human rights violations for us are driven by the choices of political elites. And for us, the solutions lie broadly in capturing public power and campaigning for change. So we work very much in partnership with organisations overseas, groups that fight against privatisation, groups that try to secure land for poor people, and to go alongside that, in the UK, we very much campaign strongly against corporations and around issues of corporate accountability. And TTIP fits within our portfolio on trade justice. I'm the trade justice campaigner, so I actually spend all my days working on TTIP. So I'm sure you know a little bit about it. To just put it in very kind of broad terms, I think it's very important that we understand from the outset that TTIP is a deal that is by and for big business. To put that in context, before TTIP was announced, before anybody had ever heard of it, we know from Freedom of Information requests that 119 secret meetings were held with big business. That's some 92-93% of all the meetings that were held. And that's something that reaches back into the 90s with the Uruguay round of the World Trade Organization. That was specifically so that big business could say what they wanted the text of the treaty to be. And that's very important that we understand that right from the outset. So the way we conceive of TTIP is 3 pillars. And those pillars are deregulation, privatisation, and investor rights. Deregulation is really very much at the heart of TTIP. When they talk about TTIP being a free trade deal, that's something that's technically incorrect, because trade between the US and the EU is by and large already free. 70% of the trade between the two countries has no tariff at the border, so there's no kind of tax, so to speak, that arrives on those goods. The remaining 30%, the average tariff is around 2 or 3%. So if anybody tells you that we face a situation where tariffs inhibit trade, it's not really that true. On a few products, yes, there are some issues around tariffs, but the vast majority, nothing. So this is where deregulation comes in. Regulations, in trade terms, what we're talking about here is what they call non-tariff barriers. So any other barrier that could stop a product coming into a country. Corporations refer to these as barriers to profit. The way we refer to them are our most prized social, environmental, health standards. For example, a minimum wage could be seen as a barrier to trade if you're a US company, because that doesn't exist to the same way in the US. If you come in here, it might mean that you're going to be inhibited in making money. At the same time, environmental regulation that we have here, and there are, as you probably know, many of them that we have that the US doesn't have, would be seen as a barrier to trade. The second pillar would be privatisation. And this is another area that's central to TTIP, contrary to what you'll hear from government officials and European Commission officials. It was made very clear at the beginning of TTIP by the US, and that's mirrored by the EU's desires, that one of the key aims of TTIP is to unlock designated monopolies in public services. And that broadly means that any and all public services will be privatised. Those that are already part privatised will not be able to be renationalised. And those that currently aren't, of which unfortunately I don't think we can say there are many at all, will be opened up to privatisation. There's a lot of complexity around how that works precisely, and I won't go into all of that now, but we have a lot of literature that explains the detail of this and why we know that, for example, the NHS is not safe from privatisation, contrary to what we were repeatedly told by the government. The third pillar, along with deregulation and privatisation, is investor rights, and this refers to what you've probably already heard about, ISDS, a corporate court system. I'm going to go into detail on this later, but suffice it to say, this is a very important element of TTIP, and it essentially is about creating a juridical framework which will privilege the interests of big business to the extent that they can supersede the state within a legal framework. So broadly speaking, a big business can take a state to court for a decision it has made that affects the business's profit or even its future profit that it's yet to make. But like I said, I'll go into some more detail on that in a minute. So some key myths around TTIP. Some of these are myths that you will repeatedly hear, and I say this from personal experience when I go to the EU Parliament, when you see releases from government, you see the same thing being repeated again and again. And more often than not, they're completely untrue. Or if not untrue, they're said in a way that is on paper true, but is very much, how should I put it, sophistry. They're saying something that's factually true, but belying the reality that's underneath there. So I'll start with environment, and I know that's something that's close to all your hearts, although I know it's also not the only issue that the Green Party focuses on. But it's also something that isn't very well understood, even by people who are aware of what's happening with TTIP. And this relates to what I was talking about earlier about deregulation. One of the key issues here around environment is deregulation. So as you may know, in Canada in particular, and in North America in general, there's been a huge boom in shale gas and tar sands oil exploration. At present, this is something that's not allowed into the EU. And just to underscore this, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, the chapter I'm referring to is called an energy chapter, not a climate chapter, but I'm referring to it in terms of climate change for reasons that become obvious. And right at the very outset, the EC Trade Commissioner said we cannot imagine a TTIP without an energy chapter. So this really is central to TTIP. And more recently, it's something that's been highlighted through, you probably won't have heard it, but a lot of politicians now are using the phrase an economic NATO when they refer to TTIP. And one of the elements of this is basically the desire to cut ties with Russia and to lose any dependency on Russian gas. Now that brings us back to what I was saying earlier around this issue of tar sands oil and shale gas. Currently, it's not allowed into the EU. One of the key regulations that's stopping this, which the US would see as a barrier to trade, is the EU Fuel Quality Directive. Now this is a directive that was established in 2009 with the specific aim of ensuring that the EU can meet its climate change obligations as captured under the Kyoto Protocol of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which we colloquially refer to as the COP negotiations, which happen every year, and this year will be in Paris in December. So the Fuel Quality Directive was established around 2009 with that specific intent. Now, as part of the Fuel Quality Directive, the EU analysed the contents of different types of fuels. One of the fuels they analysed here was tar sands oil. And they found that over the lifetime of tar sands oil, it emits, on average, around 23% more greenhouse gas emissions than the fossil fuels, the oil we currently use in the EU. So it's a quarter higher in terms of emissions. Now, over the past years, there's a story that was released maybe yesterday, I think, in The Guardian. They revealed that Canada, over the past 2 years, has spent $30 million on PR and advocacy around tar sands oil. And this is not just one express intent, but one of the key ones is for the EU to lower the Fuel Quality Directive. And this is also something that the US has been lobbying on very hard, and of course, a lot of the big oil companies. Now, back in 2013, and this is something you can find if you do the research, the US said in official trade documents reporting on their key achievements from 2013 one of their key achievements that they listed was in delaying the EU Fuel Quality Directive. This has been something that's been going on for a while because we've been aware that TTIP's coming, and in line with that, the US has been pushing for a lessening of regulations, not just around this, but around a whole host of issues ahead of TTIP. And there's been various prevarications where the EU's gone back and forth saying it will be extended, it won't be extended, but what we do know now is that it's under threat. And I also mentioned to you the big oil companies. So you may be aware what used to be called the Seven Sisters are no longer quite the same as they used to be. These are the biggest 7 oil companies. To put that in context, if we go back to the 60s, I think, 7 oil companies controlled around, I think, 85% of known oil reserves. Right now, today, that figure is down to 6%. But what they do control is the tar sands oil. So there's a huge interest from those big oil companies to push tar sands oil and get it into the EU. Now there's a barrier on the other side that also prevents this, and that is the US fuel export ban. Again, not sure if you're aware of this, but since the oil shocks in the early 70s, the US has had a ban on exports of any of its domestically produced oil. And this is specifically because when the fuel shocks happened, they caused pandemonium, and the US didn't want to be left in that position where it was beholden to prices being determined largely in the Middle East around oil. So they placed a ban on the export of any oil from the US. And right now, this year, 2015, the International Energy Agency has noted that the US will become the biggest oil producer in the world. Currently, and this is important to understand in TTIP as well, because it's not about the US versus the EU. The way we conceive of it is very much big business against people. The US government is resisting the lifting of the fuel export ban. They were on record a couple of months ago saying, we've had all these submissions asking for this to be lifted, we see no good reason to do it yet. But that is something that is going to come under more and more pressure, and indeed is already beginning to change. So 2 weeks ago, I think, we had the Senate Energy Committee passed a bill to lift the fuel export ban. This is just the first step in a process. They passed it narrowly. I can't remember exactly the number of votes, but it was only by a margin of 5 or 6 votes. From here, it will move to the Senate floor, where it would have to be passed, and from there, it would move to Congress. But those are the steps that they need to go through to lift this fuel export ban. Now, to give you some very relevant context from the EU, so about a month ago, just under, MEPs voted on a TTIP resolution, which all the Green MEPs opposed. The resolution was nonetheless passed, and it says very clearly in there, I have a copy of it here, so I won't read you the exact words, in 2 consecutive paragraphs. The first paragraph says, as well as being committed to an energy chapter in TTIP, we commit to remove any and all barriers to trade in terms of energy between the US and the EU. The next paragraph then says, we commit to, and this is my paraphrasing of it, we commit to ensuring that the EU Fuel Quality Directive will remain in place. Completely contradictory, so it enables them to say both things to whoever it is they're talking to. Now, I don't need to tell you if we're going to be using oil that emits 23% higher emissions, and there will be the creation of an infrastructure to bring this from the US to the EU. It's not all going to come by ships. I'd imagine there will be some pipes being laid. We are locking ourselves into a high carbon future. As it stands, we're recommended to leave, 70%, I think, of all fossil fuels in the ground. Increase the capacity of those fossil fuels to cause climate change by 25%, lock it in through pipelines. You can see the threat that TTIP poses to climate change. Myth number 2, jobs. I'll be much quicker on this one. This is very simple. You will not see the UK government and the EU saying officially that TTIP will bring jobs. You'll see EU parliamentarians within the chambers of parliament say anybody with a brain will realise that TTIP brings jobs. Yet, the EC commissioned an official study, which is the one that they always hark back to when they talk about growth and how great TTIP is, right at the outset of this process. We dug deep into that study, and we found in a footnote to one of the pages that they state very clearly that some 1 million jobs, and this is split between both sides of the Atlantic, will be relocated. Now, what that quite simply means is the jobs will be lost. They simply anticipate that the people who move from one sector, who are relocated and lose their jobs, will just be able to get a job in another sector. And we know that we're right on this. We've published on it, we talk about it, and they don't come to us and say you should stop saying that. And if you look into government responses, so for example, the Business Innovation and Skills Committee, Environmental Audit Committee, cross-party committees in Parliament did reports on TTIP. The government has just responded. One of the responses, and it comes from the Business Innovation Skills Secretary, he says quite notably that trade between the EU and the US is associated with X number of jobs. He never says it will bring X number of jobs because there is no study showing that it will. The official study records 1 million job losses. And just as an aside, every trade union in this country is opposed to this deal, and that tells you something in and of itself. They will oppose something if it threatens job losses, and this does. Another very easy myth to dismiss. Growth. 0.5% of the same study, 0.5% GDP increase by 2027. Now, notwithstanding everything else, that could reasonably be assumed to be more like a margin of error than something you can hang a whole policy on. 0.5% by 2027. Now, the government will say this is a very state-of-the-art model, widely accepted, and I'm actually quoting here from what they say in their response to one of the committees, widely accepted by trade economists. Yet Ken Clarke, when he met with NGOs, said these figures aren't credible. Sigmar Gabriel, who is the economy minister in Germany, came out and said this only 2 or 3 months ago, that he does not trust these wondrous calculations. The House of Lords EU Committee, which approves of TTIP, said, we nonetheless think you should, and again I paraphrase, dial it back a bit on using these figures because you risk jeopardising the whole project. The Business Innovation and Skills Committee said that we need stronger evidence to back up these growth claims. And the problem is that the government has been using these and manipulating them to quite a ridiculous extent. So the UK did its own study to match this EU study. Same model, which means you have the same inputs, the same outputs, you get the same result. They found 10 billion would come to the UK economy by this point. Now, they have since transformed that. If you have a Conservative MP and you write to them, this is what you'll hear back, in spite of them being advised that they shouldn't, they will tell you that this £10 billion means £400 in the pocket of every family in the country. A clearer example of trickle-down economics you could not find. They've divided the figure by the number of households, because obviously when we get a GDP increase, that's what happens. It gets shared out among every person in the country equally. So that's growth. SMEs, this is increasingly important because it's a line that we're seeing both within Europe and here be trumpeted a lot more. And obviously for the Tories, it's something they want to be seen to be very good with, the party of business, not just big business, but small business.
Is that small to medium?
Yes, SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises. There are very specific definitions of this. I don't actually know them by heart, but they're around the number of people working there and the amount of revenue the business generates.
It's under 250 as far as
there you go. So yeah, the government's very keen to say that this is beneficial for small businesses. But there are some very key statistics here which kind of do away with this. Well, before we get into those, one of the key things here is what I told you earlier. Of all the meetings held ahead of TTIP, held secretly, 92, 93%, 119 were with big business. You didn't see small business owners being invited to meet with the heads of state and the key architects behind this treaty to find out what they wanted in there. Now, 90% of small and medium-sized enterprises in the UK don't export. SMEs account for a huge proportion of the employees in the country and the wider marketplace in this country. But the huge majority of them at the moment have no interest in exporting. So how can we begin to sell a trade deal as for these people when they're not even engaged in this issue? Now, beyond this...
You mean exporting across the Atlantic?
Exporting full stop. I mean, exporting full stop. I do want to know that figure though. I'm looking for the figure for exporting it to the US. There has been no study on direct benefits to SMEs. So you'll see that the Chambers of Commerce will actually admit any gains for SMEs are hypothetical. They're made up. They don't know concretely what it will do for SMEs. But what we do know is that across Europe, you're seeing SME federations come out and say, we don't want TTIP. Reuters, not a small polemical news agency, but the biggest news, maybe not, maybe AP is, one of the biggest news agencies in the world, did a very nice feature piece where they went to Germany, where the big SME federation there is the biggest group in Europe, is quite simple about what it says to TTIP. 9 Danke was a headline that Reuters used. But beyond this, and this is where it becomes to be really mythologized, currently government policy can be used to favour SMEs, or to use the language that will make it relevant to these kind of trade deals. Government policy can discriminate in favour of domestic SMEs. So for example, the Tories had a commitment that by March or April, it's kind of a remarkably progressive commitment for a Tory government, that I think they wanted some 25% of all local procurement contracts to go to local small and medium-sized enterprises to help boost local economies. Likewise, they had a commitment for schools getting food for school meals from local small and medium-sized food businesses. Now, under TTIP, you cannot do that. That would violate what is called national treatment. National treatment means that any US business, you name it, Walmart, any massive corporation, cannot be discriminated against. It cannot be treated differently to any national business. That would mean if the government enacts some kind of policy to benefit specifically British small businesses, they would be threatened with a legal case under ISDS. It would be failing around national treatment, and they would be discriminating against overseas corporations. So quite simply, they couldn't enact those kind of policies. Final myth, and this is a slightly big one like environment. This is actually a series of myths around ISDS, corporate courts. I can give some examples of cases, which I'm more than willing to do, but I've only compiled this today, and it's something I've wanted to do for a while because it's quite an easy thing to do. Just monitor what politicians say about ISDS and then come back with some rejoinders to them. First one's very simple. UK has never lost an ISDS case. Not true. The UK has lost an ISDS jointly with France under the Treaty of Canterbury. I doubt anybody knows what that is. I didn't have a clue what it is. It's quite actually salient to current news. It's the treaty that established the construction of the Channel Tunnel, the Eurotunnel. They lost the case for 24 million. And again, it's an issue that's come up very recently. They were sued by Eurotunnel for failing to provide adequate security to help with issues around migrants. This was covered by Vice News. We've currently got a Freedom of Information request pending to find out exactly how much the UK did pay out on this. So that's point number one. UK has never lost an ISDS case? Not true. Number two, and this is an example of the sophistry I referred to earlier, and this was actually used in a letter from McGill University with about some 30 law academics from the US who were arguing for ISDS. Don't worry, there was a group of 100 much better academics who came together to write a letter doing the opposite. So this came after. They said ISDS cannot overturn a law. True, ISDS cannot overturn a law. But the fines issued in ISDS cases are so high that countries usually afterwards, if they have any sense, voluntarily remove the law. Because if they don't, another company will sue them for exactly the same reason. And ahead of that, there's something called, what we call regulatory chill. And this is basically when, and all lawyers know about this, you don't even have to go to court to make a change. You send the letter that says, we're going to sue you for X billion unless you change this. Now, there are great examples of where this has already been spoken about. The prime one being around NAFTA, which is a North American Free Trade Agreement. It's been in place for some 20 years now. Canada has suffered immensely under it. And just to give some context, at the very beginning of this, the Business Innovation and Skills Department commissioned the LSE to do a study on ISDS and its impacts on the UK. And they found that the UK would suffer in a similar way to Canada. And that it wouldn't have any benefits for the UK, only potential losses. They've now disowned this study because they say, well, things around ISDS have changed and we're trying to reform it. But anyway, so regulatory chill. Canadian government officials, you can read this in The Nation. There's a great long piece on ISDS going back some 15 years. An unnamed Ottawa government official says, we have tried to put in new laws, new regulations across the board on all kinds of environmental issues. Most of these have never seen the light of day because as soon as we table it, we get a letter from a law firm acting on behalf of a corporation threatening us, and they withdraw. So ISDS, no, it can't directly overturn the law from its ruling, but regulatory chill, the threat of punitive fines, the actual issuing of punitive fines will result in the laws being overturned anyway. This is a couple that I'll merge into one, which is that ISDS, and I get sick of seeing this because people do it on Twitter. I get engaged in these Twitter debates with people who say ISDS is about the law. It's about creating the law. Don't you believe in international law? I'm no lawyer. I haven't studied law beyond studying media law when I trained to be a journalist, but I know that the law is built from diverse sources, and you can't simply say that ISDS is the law. Now, to give you some examples here of where ISDS is very problematic, I'll break this down into national law and international law. So sovereignty of courts is something that's very important, their independence. I'll give you a couple of cases here which will highlight some of the problems with ISDS. Eli Lilly, US pharmaceutical company, currently suing the USA under NAFTA, a long-running case after Canada refused permits for 2 of their drugs. They're suing them for $500 million. Before they launched this NAFTA case, they tried to deal with this issue through the Canadian justice system. Their case was heard by 9 different Canadian judges, every single one of whom rejected it. But when they couldn't get it through that, they immediately went the NAFTA deal to launch an ISDS case. Now, if that doesn't tell you something about ISDS and the sovereignty of the domestic legal system, Australia, Philip Morris, very similar. So you may or may not know they're being sued currently by Philip Morris. I don't know how many different courts they went through, but what's important here is that this case was heard in Australia's highest court. And it was heard on a constitutional basis in which it was ruled that Australia constitutionally has the right to stop cigarettes, or the other way around, to force Marlboro, Philip Morris, to sell their cigarettes in plain packaging. And Australia was categorically very clear about why it wanted to do this. It's stated in the legal documents. This is about public health. Millions of people die. We want to stop that. That wasn't good enough for Philip Morris. They opened up a subsidiary in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a free trade deal with Australia, which has ISDS provisions. They are now suing Australia through that mechanism. Now, if your own highest court rules on your own constitution and says that you can do this, how can a trade deal signed behind closed doors, which nobody even knew about, let alone the constitutional lawyers, how can that override your national law? Now, at an international level, some people have said this much better than I can. You can find these statements very easily. This is a statement from the UN rapporteur on, let me get this correct, the UN rapporteur on the promotion of the democratic and equitable international order. And this is a statement from 10 different UN special rapporteurs. In each case, they're expressing their worries, broadly speaking, about the impacts on human rights from trade deals, the new kind of trade regime, so trade deals like TTIP, TISA, and the TPP. Specifically with this one from the sole rapporteur on the democratic and equitable international order, he says, and I'll quote here, pursuant to Article 103 of the Charter provisions, the UN Charter provisions of free trade and investment agreements, as well as decisions of ISD arbitrators, must conform with the UN Charter and must not lead to a violation, erosion, or retrogression in human rights protection or compromise state sovereignty and the state's fundamental obligation to ensure the human rights and well-being of all persons living under its jurisdiction. Agreements or arbitral decisions that violate international human rights law are null and void as incompatible with Article 103 of the UN Charter. Unfortunately here, UN special rapporteurs don't have a huge amount of power, if any at all, but nonetheless, that's a fairly significant statement from a lawyer who's very well versed in international law. Now remember what he said here about cases in human rights law. Here's one that I've written about for an article in The Guardian that you should be able to access. This is about Argentina. Argentina, more than any country, knows the perils of ISDS. They have been sued, I think, in the region of 40 times for actions they took during the financial crisis they endured around the period 2000 to 2002. If you don't remember it, this was devastating. I think one stat from that era is that some 70% of children were living in poverty at that point. Now, one of the issue I wrote about, and that's very relevant here, is they were sued by a few water companies who had a subsidiary in Argentina, but I'll name a couple of them right now. One is Suez, which is always implicated in these kind of issues, and another is our own Anglian Water. Now, Argentina was sued for fixing the price of water. These companies had a private contract to supply the water, and Argentina unilaterally, in the financial crisis, fixed the price of water. There's a human right to water and sanitation. The human right to water has a set of standards. One of these standards is affordability. And that means your ability to buy water must not be impaired by you having to pay. You should always be able to buy your water. And it sits alongside other key rights, which are housing, health, and education. If any one of those, if you have to spend disproportionately on any one and it means you can't afford to buy the other, that's a violation of your right. So for water, you have to be able to afford it, because we all know if you don't have water, you're going to die. What happened when Argentina did this? They were sued. Maybe 3 months ago, they were ordered to pay $405 million to these water companies for what they did. Now, you can look up the case details. It's one of the few cases where you can actually access the arguments. Argentina's defense: we were upholding the human right to water in the interests of our citizens. But the problem with these investment tribunals, they are a body of law that is based on that specific treaty. So the arbitrators, the three corporate lawyers, they have to go back to the terms of the treaty. The terms of the treaty are to protect investments. They say nothing about human rights. So there's a default approach, which means that the protection of the rights of the investor supersede human rights. So that's international. States win. This is something that you hear a lot, but we've recently learned that the statistics, how they are put together, have changed. So you always used to hear that states win more cases than investors. Roughly 40% won by states, 30% by investors, the rest neither. But the way an ISDS tribunal works is that, first of all, you have a jurisdictional hearing. Is this the right place to be hearing this? Is this treaty right to be covering this issue? Once that's decided, you then have the hearing on the issue itself. Now, before, they brought together the results of both into one. And that's how they came up with states states winning more than investors. When you get rid of the jurisdictional hearing, which obviously isn't whether you win or lose, simply whether the case should be heard there, states win 40%, investors win 60%. But what's important to note here, and this was the response we'd always give when people say that states win more, it's not about who wins more ultimately, it's about the flaws of the system, and it shouldn't be there. But just in case people tell you that states win more than investors, untrue. It's about business contracts, and it's about investments and expropriation. To an extent, it can be sometimes. But fundamentally, ISDS goes way, way beyond any idea of what we would understand as contract law, where you breach a contract, somebody has to pay. And I'll focus on one issue here, and that is the definition of what an investment is. The text for the Canada-Europe Free Trade Deal is available. You can go there and see this spelled out. One of the key definitions of investment includes anticipated future profits. So it's money you haven't even made yet. You may have seen that Romania is being sued for, I think, $4 billion by a mining company, a Canadian mining company, through the UK's free trade deal with Romania. It has a subsidiary in Jersey. That's how they're accessing the trade deal. But they've said they've only spent, I may be wrong on this, I'm aware I'm on camera, but they've only spent something like 500 million on the mine so far. Around 5 million. A significant amount less than what it is they're suing for, 4 billion. I think it's 500 million to 4 billion. And that's covered by this definition of investment. They're suing for what they believe they would have made in the future. Likewise, Canada being sued for banning fracking in Quebec. They're being sued for 250 million. That's simply because Lone Pine Resources, the company which is taking this case, is saying that we had plans to frack and we would have made this much money. And TTIP, as everybody keeps saying, the Canada deal is the dry run for TTIP. So the way investment is defined will likely be exactly the same. Couple more very quick ones. ISDS is not just for big business. Very true, anybody can access ISDS. But the average cost of a case is $8 million. Now, if you're a little small business, you're not going to want to risk having to pay that. And part of the problem here is that it's not the case that the loser has to pay everything. For example, even if a state wins a case, we still have to pay the costs to the lawyers, who are the real winners in all this. And there's some great primers out there and books done on this and how it's fueling an arbitration boom, which is coming very much to the benefit of law firms. And there are a couple of them in London which benefit extremely from this. So ISDS isn't just for big business, but obviously not all businesses can afford to access it. And then finally, what you're going to hear in a month or two in September when the EU presents its reform proposal is that ISDS doesn't exist anymore. You're going to hear about a permanent investment court. ISDS is dead. And this is the centre of their reforms deal with three issues, and that is that the cases are heard in secret. There is no right to appeal, what they will call in legal terms an appellate mechanism, and that they are presided over by corporate lawyers. They've dealt with this by trying to ensure that there is a right of appeal, that they are presided over by a roster of judges, and that the proceedings are in public and there is open access. But it's still ISDS because it's a court system outside of our system where only business can access it to sue the state. There's no system where organised labour can sue businesses in a special court system for itself. There's no system where states can sue corporations for human rights abuses. Indeed, there is no legally binding mechanism to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses, and our government was one of the few last year which opposed attempts to create such a legally binding mechanism. So finally with ISDS, the one argument that we always say here, and this refers back to Magna Carta, where Amelia Womack came and spoke at one of our events, and that is quite simply that ISDS destroys equality before the law. Equality for the law before the law dates back to Magna Carta, and that means the legal system there is for each and every one of us, and we are no different before it. That does not mean whether you call it investment court, call it what you want, that you can have a legal system which is only available for one sector of our society, essentially corporations. So that's our key line with ISDS. So those are the myths: environment, jobs, growth, SMEs, and ISDS. And finally, just to close, I wanted to deal with what can you do about this. You've probably already signed the European Citizens Initiative. If you haven't, please do. We've got some 2.4 million signatures currently. It's going to time out officially on October the 6th. That leads me into what you can do next. There'll be a day of action which will be held all around Europe, and we'll have events here in London and around the country on October the 10th. That's a Saturday. There'll also be some events, if you ever happen to be around Manchester, the weekend before in Manchester, where some groups, including the People's Assembly and ourselves and some trade union groups, are protesting at the Tory Party conference, which will be held in Manchester that weekend. So if you happen to be in Manchester, we're going to be having some big things happening on the 5th. Otherwise, London, 10th of October. Do sign up to War on One for updates, if nothing else. It will just mean me sending you details around these kind of things. And we also give free materials to anybody who wants them. So I have a range of things here. Please do take something, if not for yourself, to give to someone else. If you ever need anything to give to people, just get in touch. We'll post it to you. I'll put it in the envelope personally, and you can have it to distribute for other people. Because that would be my final ask of you. Just tell somebody about this. The more people that know about this, the more chance we have of making it toxic, building up people power, and stopping TTIP. And I hope I've given you some light into just why it's so important that we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Brilliant presentation and bloody scary.